It is Valentine's Day and love is in the air, but what if it's also in the workplace? Today, what I want to talk about is romance in the workplace. And you can go online and find dozens of surveys out there and studies out there, which will tell you that anywhere from a third to three-quarters of you have engaged in some form of office romance. And a significant number of those have actually led to marriage, which is quite interesting. Best and probably most famous example is the Obamas. As many people know, Barack met Michelle when she was his supervisor at a law firm. Obviously, that relationship worked out very well. Others, not so much. The issue of workplace romance, like many other aspects of employment law, generates some really strong views. You've got people who will say that they should never be allowed. They should be banned outright and absolutely with no exceptions. And then you get other people who say that what two people do on their own time is their own business and none of the employers. And the truth, as it usually is somewhere in the middle. Here's a couple of key points. There's nothing inherently wrong with two people that work for the same organization having a romantic or intimate relationship. Secondly, employers don't have a right to interfere with their employees' personal lives and certainly don't have a right to cast any moral judgments upon their personal lives. And frankly, as I've told many of my clients, trying to ban workplace relationships, trying to have a non-fraternization policy, which is still fairly common, there's simply no good reason for it, and it's a losing battle that you're probably never going to be able to enforce, so don't bother. But when should employers be concerned? They should be concerned if the relationship is going to impact the workplace. So if it creates a conflict of interest, you got to deal with it. If it prevents those involved or other people from doing their job, you got to deal with it. If there is a non-consensual element or an element of harassment to it, then you've got to deal with it. Otherwise, don't bother and don't worry about it. Don't have the non-fraternization policy, but you need to have two strong policies. You need to have a policy against conflict of interest and a policy against harassment. In the context of conflict of interest, make it clear that you cannot have one party to a relationship that controls the other party's compensation, career path, their workload, their reviews. All of that is offside. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about a romantic relationship or a parent and child or a brother and sister. Those are all conflicts of interest that need to be dealt with. In your policy, you should have a very clear requirement that employees will report any conflict of interest. They don't have to report the fact they're dating their colleague. But if there is a conflict of interest, they must report it. And again, that's only if there is a potential conflict of interest. But if the employee does come forward or the couple comes forward, then you as the employer have to assess whether there is any real conflict of interest, and if so, how you deal with it. Then what you want to do is have the two employees sign off on the fact that the relationship is consensual, that they agree that it will not impact the workplace, they agree that they will abide by all workplace policies. Here's one of the catches, though. You have a policy which says that you must disclose relationships if there's a conflict of interest. But in many cases, people don't want to disclose the relationship. Maybe it's an extramarital affair. Maybe they're embarrassed for some other reason. They don't want to. And at my firm, we've coached many people who have been involved in relationships, and we've told them, look, you've got to disclose it. You're dating your subordinate. You can't do that. But they don't want to because their wife or their husband might find out. And as we advise employees all the time, if that's the case, you have to. The company has the right to know about the conflict of interest and their potential liability. And realistically, as I often tell our clients, if you think that nobody knows about your workplace relationship, you're sadly mistaken. Realistically, people already know about it. People are talking. So this isn't going to come as a shock. And the reality is, it's very unlikely you can be fired for having a workplace relationship, but you probably can be fired if there is a conflict of interest, and particularly if you are dishonest. And there's some famous case out there that I've reviewed in my book called You're Fired, where people have been confronted and a supervisor has been asked if they're having a relationship with a subordinate. They were, but they lied about it. And they were given a second chance and lied about it, and a third chance and lied about it. And eventually they were fired. And they were fired not for having a relationship. They were fired for breaching the policy against conflict of interest and for dishonesty. And the termination was upheld because the court found they could not be trusted anymore. So if you're in the relationship, you've got to protect yourself from discipline. You've also got to protect yourself. We unfortunately have advised many people who are stuck in quote unquote relationships that are not consensual. Essentially, it's harassment. And if you're in one of those relationships, you need to get legal advice, and you need to check your company's policy to find out how to report that harassment or that abuse of power. if you're in a relationship with someone at work and as far as you know it's consensual, this may not sound very romantic. You need to document the fact that it's consensual. You want to keep copies of the cards and the notes, and or more likely today, the text messages and the emails. Because at some point, if there's an allegation that it was non-consensual, if there's an allegation that you were harassing your partner, you want to be able to prove that no, in fact, it was consensual and have the documentation. Unfortunately, I've seen many situations where there was a consensual relationship and it ended, and then one party had misgivings or was worried their spouse was going to find out. And the only way they could justify the relationship to their spouse was by saying, I was forced into it. So you have this after the fact allegation of harassment. And if you were party to that relationship, you want to have those text messages which show that they were not forced into it. It was consensual. On that point, critical as employers, as I mentioned before, have a harassment policy. Define what harassment is, define abuse of power, because you may have a supervisor or a manager who thinks they are dating their subordinate and that it's all consensual, but really the subordinate's only going along because they think that if they don't, they're going to lose their job. They need to be trained on what that means, what harassment can constitute. So have a strong policy. In Ontario, you also have to have reporting mechanisms for reporting harassment, which means having, first of all, a primary mechanism and a secondary. So if your boss is also your harasser, you need to know who else you can turn to report the harassment so that you're not essentially stuck in the relationship. Bottom line, it is Valentine's Day. Romance is hopefully in the air and may well be in the workplace. There's nothing wrong with a workplace romance. If you're an employer, don't bother trying to ban it. Have clear policies against conflicts of interest and against harassment. Have clear reporting mechanisms that everyone's aware of and make sure everyone's aware of them. If you're in a workplace romance or relationship, make sure you have the evidence to show that it was consensual. And if you're stuck in one that's not consensual, make sure you go see a lawyer and report it. If you're unsure of your rights or your obligations, go see an employment lawyer. I know it sounds self-serving, but as I always say in my episodes of Fire Away, if you think you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. So feel free to reach out to one. That's my 2 cents worth today, and you got it here for free.